All right, so good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending today's virtual information session. My name is Tori Visner, and I'm DPR's Alliance Grants Program Lead. And today we're going to be talking all about crafting a scope of work, including writing objectives, tasks, and deliverables intended to support your application. And this meeting is our fifth in a series of virtual information meetings, and these are intended to help you prepare your proposal application. I do want to preface this meeting by noting that DPR currently has 2 open solicitations. So we are currently accepting applications for our research grants program and for our Alliance grants program. The information that's going to be covered in this meeting is going to be relevant to both programs. And throughout this talk, I'll be making references to both programs and specifying areas that maybe apply to only one program or the other. If at any point you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or drop questions in the chat. There will be time at the end of this session for questions. DPR's research grants lead, Jordan Weibel, unfortunately is unable to attend today's meeting, but I have a lot of my colleagues that are also on this call, and together we should be able to answer any questions that you may have. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so today we're going to be talking specifically about the scope of work, and the objective of this virtual information meeting is for you to really understand the purpose and the role of each of the components that make up the scope of work. So hopefully this will give you a better idea as to why we ask for each of these different sections to be completed. So the different sections that are included in the scope of work are the intended audience, the project abstract, the project summary, team members, goals, objectives, tasks, and deliverables. And then here on the right side of the screen, this is just a screenshot of the instructions for the project abstract and summary that's pulled directly from our proposal application. So first of all, let's go ahead and take a zoomed out look at the scope of work. So the scope of work begins with a broad overview of the project and proceeds down to specific implementation steps of a given project. So it begins with general broad information, including things like the title, the abstract, summaries, goals, and team members. We then zoom in a little bit to the objectives that are based on the goals and the tasks that support these objectives. And then finally, zooming in even more, we get to deliverables and deliverable due dates that are provided to DPR. And these demonstrate to DPR and to the project's assigned grant manager that the tasks have been completed. So let's go ahead and discuss the audience for the scope of work. And to fully understand this, I think it's really essential to understand that the scope of work has multiple roles. And the first of those roles is that the scope of work makes up a large portion of the proposal application. And it is read by 2 groups who will be reviewing and ranking proposal applications. And so the first of those reviewer groups is going to be the Pest Management Advisory Committee, or PMAC. PMAC is a volunteer group made up of a wide variety of stakeholders, and they review proposal applications and provide DPR's director with a recommendation of which grants should be funded. This occurs at a public meeting that is webcasted. There's a public meeting that's held for discussing the research grants, and then a separate one for discussing the Alliance grants. If you're interested, you can get more information on the date and time that these meetings will be held on our website. And then the second reviewer group is composed of DPR staff. So internally, DPR staff, primarily from DPR's research or from DPR's grants program, review and rank proposal applications. And so for both of these reviewer groups, the scope of work really shows how the project is going to accomplish its goals and its objectives. And so that's really the first role of the scope of work. The second role of the scope of work applies to projects that receive funding from DPR. And so for those projects that receive funding, the scope of work is used to develop a first draft of the grant agreement that is eventually signed by both DPR and by the grantee. And so because of this, we really recommend that the scope of work use a formal tone. We recommend it include clear language, avoid jargon, define any acronyms that are used the first time, and be understandable to both a scientific and a non-scientific audience. All right, so moving on to the project abstract. So this is going to be the first portion of the scope of work within the proposal application. And for some of you, if you have applied previously to our grants program or have maybe just looked at our materials, this portion is going to be new this year. And the reason for that is the project abstract is intended to fulfill a legal requirement that's given to us by the California State Library Grants Portal. Some of you may have visited their website before, or you may have found our grants program through them. But if you haven't, I do highly recommend the grants portal as a resource. Their website, which is grants.ca.gov, allows interested individuals to search for grants that they're eligible for. And one of the requirements of this grants portal is that all funding agencies, including DPR, do need to report on what projects end up being funded, including information like the project title, the amount that it's funded for, the organization, and a brief project abstract. And so this project abstract is intended to fulfill that role. And so the abstract should be for a general audience, and there is a very short character limit of 600 characters. So essentially, we really recommend treating your abstract as an elevator pitch. The details that should be contained in the abstract should be the project's purpose, the priorities, the scope, and the grant beneficiaries. And I completely understand that that is a lot of information to fit into that 600 character limit. So really, we just emphasize that this should be a very streamlined version of the project summary. Again, just really that elevator pitch. Grant beneficiaries are going to be those who will benefit from the execution of the funded project. So those are going to be individuals like stakeholders, they're going to be communities, individuals, organizations, entities. So basically any beneficiary that the grant intends to serve. And so because these project abstracts will be posted publicly, again, should your project receive funding, these project abstracts should be concise and they should be understandable to the general public. So moving on to our first example, and throughout this presentation, I'm going to pull up a bunch of examples, both sample alliance and sample research portions of the proposal application. And I just want to preface this by saying that this example and then all of the future examples that I'm going to be including in this presentation were developed by DPR staff. They are entirely fictional examples. They are simply intended to provide our applicants with a comprehensive example of how to complete a scope of work and then also how to complete budgets and budget tables. These examples are in no way intended to describe DPR's preferred grant topics, not intended to describe the number of ideal project members, budget sizes, anything like that. They're not at all intended to limit your creativity. These examples are all pulled from documents on our website called guidance documents, and there is one guidance document that is specific for our Alliance Grants program, and then another that is specific for our Research Grants program. And within these guidance documents, in addition to a full-length scope of work, there are budget tables, there's sample budget justifications. There's also a lot of useful information, including some recommendations on completing your application. And then there's also some frequently asked questions, so responses to some frequently asked questions included in there. And again, these guidance documents were created to assist our applicants with some common questions, particularly as they pertain to both the scope of work portion and then also the budget portions. So I highly recommend reviewing those resources. Again, those are available on our website. And so this is an example of a project abstract that is pulled from the Sample Alliance scope of work. Now, in that document, the abstract is written in paragraph form, but here we've broken it down by different sections just so you can see how this example addresses all of the requirements of the abstract. And so we see that there is a sentence that's focusing on purpose. So the purpose, this project will increase the adoption of early detection and rapid response to support the management of invasive plants in California wildlands. Then there is a sentence that focuses on the priorities. So this project will reduce the number of pesticide applications and amounts of pesticide required to control them. There's a sentence on scope. You see community science networks will be created by recruiting members of the public, volunteer groups, and work crews, and provided with tools to detect and record early populations of invasive plants. And then finally, there is a sentence that focuses on the grant beneficiaries. So this work will benefit Californians whose health may be impacted by ecosystems degraded by invasive plants or the pesticides used to manage them. And I just want to make a side note here that the eligibility requirements of both of our programs, so both our Alliance grants and our research grants program, do require that work benefit Californians. So I really encourage all of our applicants to be mindful of that and recognize the importance of clearly stating how your project will benefit Californians at the end of the day. All right, so moving on to our project summary. So the project summary is very similar to the project abstract, but with a page limit rather than a character limit. So here you're limited to 1 page maximum as opposed to 600 characters. And so because it is a longer limit, essentially, the summary should really be a more thorough description of the project. It should be understandable to the general public, but again, given that it does have a 1 page limit, it should still be fairly brief. We do understand, that it is sometimes difficult to distill all of the information that, is occurring over a 2.5 to 3 year project down to 1 page. But these project summaries really are intended to be just brief and compelling descriptions of the proposed projects. So the details contained in the project summary should be, again, a broad overview of the proposed project. It should address the relevance of the project to the mission of the department. And again, this, along with benefiting Californians, is really a key component, I would say, that's very important for our applicants to consider, is how your project is relating to the mission of the department. And then finally, your project summary should not include or rely on references. And what we mean when we say that it shouldn't rely on references is really that the summary should not be a heavily cited document. Again, this should be understandable by the general public. And so really the reader of this summary should be able to understand the project without needing to go in and read and interpret the scientific literature that may be cited in the project summary. So now I'd like to touch a little bit on some key differences between the project summaries for both the research grants and the Alliance grants. So for the research grants, the summary should really include some specific scientific details. So again, do keep in mind that the audience here is the general public, but details included should include things like experimental design. So whether or not your experiment is going to be controlled or observational in nature, any methods that are going to be used, so as they relate to statistical methods, modeling methods, things like that. And then again, I'd like to highlight that it should include the relevance to DPR's mission. Now for the Alliance grants, so Alliance grants are focused on promoting adoption, expansion, and implementation of integrated pest management. And so the details should include the target audience and geographical area. So this is really essential because adoption, expansion, implementation efforts, so things like outreach, things like training efforts, these can often be very regional in nature. So it's important to include the target audience and the geographical area. Additionally, the outreach or communication framework that will be used should be detailed. So things like how field days or how trainings are going to be held, or how, basically how information is going to be spread. We'd like the project summary to touch on the potential for implementation, expansion, and adoption. We would like it to include methods for measuring success. So how are you going to meaningfully evaluate what you've done in your project? And again, that should be detailed out such that the reviewer is able to understand how you are going to go about that and how you're going to go about determining whether or not your project was successful. And then again, just to highlight again, these should include the relevance of the project to DPR's mission. All right, so let's move on to an example. So this is an example from the sample alliance scope of work. And so we see various sections. Again, this in the sample document is written in paragraph form. And again, this document in full is available on our website, but here we've kind of chunked it up and pulled out the relevant sections from that full-length text. So you can really see how different sentences from this summary relate to the various requirements of the project summary. And so for the purpose, we see this project will increase the adoption of early detection and rapid response to support the management of invasive plant species and reduce or eliminate the use of pesticides in California wildlands. Then moving on to target audience, this project proposes to employ community science by engaging members of the public, volunteer groups, and work crews by giving them the tools to detect and record potentially invasive plants. Then moving on to geographic area and outreach framework, we have efforts will initially focus on parks in the Sacramento Valley before expanding throughout California with outreach to other regions, such as the East Bay area, Monterey Bay, and North Coast. And so this is something that we frequently see in our Alliance grant projects. Often, say in the first year, there will be more of a focused outreach efforts that'll take place in a much smaller area, for example, like the Sacramento Valley. And then in subsequent years, we'll see an expansion to other regions. So for example, in this one, such as the East Bay, Monterey Bay, and the North Coast. Then moving on to measurements of success. So measurements of project success, such as the number of people trained and the number of verified observations that result in management action after the Sacramento Valley trainings, will inform suggestions for program improvement prior to extending the early detection and rapid response program to other regions. And then finally, we have the implementation potential and relevance to the department's mission. So furthermore, by promoting relationships and direct communication between community scientists and local land managers, invasive plant populations will be identified and addressed more promptly, resulting in more effective non-chemical control efforts and a decrease in pesticide use to effectively control these populations. So again, the full length of these project summaries is available on our website. Again, it's very similar to what we read in the abstract on these previous slides, but with a little more information and a little more detail. But it's very key that these are still intended for a general audience. All right, so moving on to the team members. So there are essentially three different types of team members that I'm going to cover here. We have the principal investigator, we have key personnel, and we have non-key personnel. And full definitions of these can be found in our terms and conditions. Our terms and conditions are also available on our website. But I think we've done a good job of covering really the essentials of what each of these roles entails. And kind of before I get into it, I just want to highly recommend thinking about these different roles and definitions and really ensuring that the proper individual is listed as the appropriate type of team member. And so the first type of role I want to cover is going to be the principal investigator, or PI. So the PI is going to be the individual who has the primary responsibility for things like financial management, control of project funds, and they're really responsible for all aspects of project administration. So including things like ensuring the scientific integrity and management of the project. They're going to ensure the financial management of project funds. They are the individual that is responsible for adhering to DPR's terms and conditions, including reporting and record keeping requirements. And again, I just want to point out that our terms and conditions are posted on our website. And as part of the proposal application process, applicants do certify that they have read and understand the terms and conditions and can adhere to all of them when submitting the application. So I just want to remind our applicants to be mindful of the legal requirement there. Just as a side note, if you are looking through the terms and conditions and have any questions at all, please do feel free to reach out to me and my colleagues. I will share the email that you can reach us at towards the end of this presentation, but we are always happy to answer any questions and do any clarification or things like that. And then finally, the principal investigator is going to be responsible for monitoring the performance and expenditure of any consultants, subcontractors, and subawardees prior to approving those individuals' invoices. I would like to highlight that the principal investigator does need to personally participate in the project to a significant degree. So we don't want one of those situations where the PI is just the PI really in name alone and has entirely passed off a project to someone like a project manager or something like that. We really do expect that the principal investigator is participating in the project. There may be cases where a co-PI is acceptable, but in general, we do prefer to have one PI really take on that role as the responsible individual, really essentially for communication purposes with DPR. We don't have any issues if outside of the grant agreement, you would like to go forth with specifying other individuals as a co-PI, things like that. But really, it's helpful to have just one key person that DPR can reach out to regarding any questions, and that one person be kind of responsible for, again, the financial management and the overall project administration. I do want to note that as part of the proposal application, a CV or a resume does need to be provided for the principal investigator. Again, if you think that there's a situation where multiple co-PIs, so say 2 co-PIs is appropriate, a CV or a resume would need to be submitted for both of those co-PIs. All right, moving on to key personnel. So again, the definition of key personnel can be found in full in our terms and conditions that are on our website, but this gives a pretty thorough overview of what a key personnel entails. So the key personnel, I would say, is pretty similar to a principal investigator, but they're not the ones that are responsible for those high-level financial management responsibilities. They're not responsible for, ensuring scientific integrity, ensuring compliance with terms and conditions, things like that. But they do contribute to the scientific development and execution of the project in a really substantive and measurable way, whether or not salaries are required. So for any individual listed in a project, in-kind donations of time are completely fine. No funds requested is completely acceptable. But they do need to devote a measurable percentage of effort to the project, and that does need to be reported. So again, time commitment or percent of effort does need to be documented. So for example, something like 20% time. And again, it's totally fine if it's an in-kind donation, but again, we just do need it to be specified. So the key personnel does not include individuals like students. So for example, undergraduate students or other named staff that are not specifically required for the completion of the scope of work. So really, key personnel are essential to carry out all of the tasks that are listed within the scope of work. Without a key personnel, there is a likelihood that, a portion of the project could not be carried out. Similarly to the PI, a CV or a resume does need to be provided for each key personnel as part of the application package. And really, one of the reasons why I highly recommend being mindful of how individuals that are participating in the project are listed is because should your project get funded, any changes in key personnel or in the principal investigator are going to require a grant amendment. And so a grant amendment is a formal process to change the grant agreement. It does require that the agreement go out for signatures again. So it needs to be signed by both the grantee and by DPR's director. And so it's just, I would say, in your best interest to try and characterize individuals appropriately, because again, if say you were to list an undergraduate student as key personnel and then they were to graduate and would no longer be working on the project, that would then trigger a grant amendment process in order to remove them from the grant application because they would no longer be acting as that key personnel. And so let's discuss non-key personnel then. So this is the final category. So individuals that do not fit into the principal investigator role or into the key personnel role are going to be listed as non-key personnel. So these are going to be individuals like students or other named staff that are not specifically required for completion of the scope of work. So again, your key personnel are going to be individuals that are specifically required to carry out the scope of work. Here you're going to have those that are not specifically required. So for example, we often see these in cases like undergraduate researchers, field labor, lab assistants, kind of roles like that, where, you know, their role is absolutely can be essential to fulfilling the scope of work, but the exact individual is not required. So for example, for a lab assistant, it doesn't necessarily need to be any specific one lab assistant. So it's kind of one of those cases where, you know, it's a little less essential for completion of the scope of work. Often these roles may not have been filled yet when you are completing your proposal application. So in cases like that, it is absolutely appropriate to just put TBD as a placeholder. For the Alliance grants, these should include all known Alliance team members. And again, for roles that are known but unfilled, we recommend listing TBD along with the description of the Alliance team role. And this last bullet point, this virtual information session has already occurred, but I do just want to flag it and say that we have recorded all of these information sessions and we are working very hard to get them up and posted on our website so they can be of use to all of you. It is a little bit of a lengthy process as we do have to edit them and do a little bit of work behind the scenes to adhere to the Americans with Disabilities Act when we go to post these. But I do just want to note that we are working on getting these up in the coming weeks, and that you will be able to go and listen to that Alliance team virtual information session that really gives a lot of tips and tricks on how to build a strong Alliance team. And so here we have an example from the previously noted Alliance sample scope of work. And so here we see that there is a single principal investigator that's listed. There's a number of non-key personnel listed, and then a number of key personnel listed. And again, I just want to highlight again that the primary reason for characterizing individuals appropriately is, again, to try and minimize the need to go through and complete an amendment to revise team members' roles if, say, someone's listed as a key personnel and, you know, they leave the organization or something like that and will no longer be working on the project. All right, so next I'd like to talk a little bit about goals. So essentially there should really be a line drawn from goals down through objectives, through tasks, and then finally down through deliverables. And so your goals are going to be general bulleted statements about what the project needs to accomplish in order to fulfill its stated purpose. So goals should be both measurable and achievable. And again, as I mentioned, that line from goals down through objectives, tasks, down to deliverables, goals should be closely correlated with the deliverables. And so here we have some example goals from the Alliance scope of work. So again, from that sample scope of work. This project has 4 goals. The first one, engage and educate community members and field crews in identifying and documenting observations of invasive and early detection and rapid response listed species through the use of a mobile application. We have goal 2 is devise a plan for land managers to verify observations submitted by community members and field crews and implement appropriate control favoring non-chemical methods. For goal 3, we have evaluate and refine the early detection and rapid response program for future adoption. And then the final goal is perform outreach by promoting and demonstrating the program in other regions. And then to show kind of the counterpart example from the research sample scope of work, we see this one has 3 goals. Evaluate prophylactic treatments and delivery methods for suppressing Xylella fastidiosa in grapevine. Goal 2 is optimize conditions for establishing and maintaining parasitoid wasp populations to combat glassy winged sharpshooters in citrus groves. And then the final goal is determine if an integrated pest management system incorporating prophylactic treatments in vineyards and parasitoid wasp-mediated suppression of glassy winged sharpshooters in citrus groves synergistically reduce the prevalence and spread of Pierce's disease. And so I'm going to be referring back to these goals throughout the remainder of the presentation, again, given that they closely relate and tie into the objectives, then the tasks, and then the deliverables. So next, let's focus in on the objectives and consider how they relate to goals. So the objectives are going to be short statements that include descriptions of the process that will lead to results that will achieve the project's goals. So objectives by nature should be more specific than goals. There should be one or more objective developed for each goal. So there shouldn't be any essentially orphan goals that don't have an affiliated objective with them. And then I just want to touch on objective 1 and note that objective 1 is consistent across all of DPR grants. It's not supposed to be modified by the applicant at all. And I'm going to give some more details in the upcoming slides on that, both just to make applicants a little more aware of some of the requirements of our grants, but also to use as an example of how goals relate to objectives, relate to tasks, relate to deliverables. All right, so again, as I mentioned, objective 1 is going to be common to all of our grants. Again, these should not be modified. There is a potential, if your project gets funded and for some reason, say your timeline is more truncated, there may be a little bit of flexibility to go in and, edit some of these due dates or something like that. But in general, these should not be modified, and they especially should not be modified at this point. And so this is just one example of an objective, a task, and a deliverable as it relates to the goal of general grant administration. And so here we see objective 1 is conduct general grant administration and deliver a project research plan, required meetings, quarterly and annual progress reports, invoices, and a final report. And so the first task that is contained under objective 1 is to hold an initial project meeting. And this meeting, the grant manager and the principal investigator meet either in person or virtually within 30 days of the grant agreement being executed. The agenda of the meeting will be a review of the role of the PI, project timeline, project deliverables, and provides an opportunity to discuss any questions regarding objectives and tasks. So the deliverable associated with this task is going to be meeting minutes as a Microsoft Word file via email within 30 days of the meeting occurring. And again, that due date will be 30 days from grant execution for the meeting to occur, and then the meeting minutes within 30 days of the meeting. And again, this is just one example. We're going to be looking at plenty more examples of tasks, deliverables, and due dates, both as they relate to objective 1 and as they relate to some of the sample scope of works that I've shown regarding the Alliance and the research grants. All right, within the research grants scope of work, task 1.2 is to complete a research plan. And so this is going to be a proposed experimental design for department review. And it's really going to detail how the project is going to be conducted. So it's going to include things like relevant methods and procedures, working hypotheses, experimental design, the choice of statistical software, treatments, sampling methods, kind of anything like that that relates to how the actual experiments are going to be carried out. For the research grants, this is going to be the deliverable associated is going to be a brief summary report, including any tables, figures, images that are needed to fully explain the research plan. And the due date is going to be within 30 days of the grant being executed. For Alliance grants, task 1.2 is a little different in that it's an outreach plan instead of a research plan. But the general idea is the same, where it's really an overview of how the project is going to be carried out. And so for the Alliance grants, the outreach plan is going to include information like the Alliance team members, the schedule, the methods that are needed to accomplish the outreach, and the measures of success for determining if the outreach is going to be effective. Similarly, the deliverable for this one is going to be a brief summary report that's submitted with tables, figures, and images as needed. And then the due date for that deliverable is going to be within 30 days of the agreement being executed. Skipping forward a little bit, we have task 1.6. And I'm sure, as all of you may have guessed, the numbering here is based on the numbers of tasks. And so task 1.6, the one stands for the objective. So because this is a task that's under objective 1, it's task 1, and then the 0.6 is it's the 6th task that is contained within the objective. So that's just the standard kind of numbering that we use, and we do ask that you parallel that as you proceed through objectives 2, 3, and onward as you're actually developing your scope of work. So the annual reports are going to be detailed accounts of results to date, any problems encountered, any milestones achieved, and then plans for the upcoming year. These reports should focus on results, problems, milestones, and plans that are explicitly related to project deliverables, and they need to clearly describe any potential or actual effects of deliverables on completion dates. So the deliverable here is going to be an annual report that is due June 30th of each year, except for in the final year of the project. And again, you see that due date there is every June 30th through June of 2025 for this year's grants. And then kind of the final example I want to touch on from objective 1 is going to be the final report. So the final report, the task description here is final report incorporating any feedback, edits, or revisions to the draft final report. It should be submitted to the grant manager, and it may be published on DPR's website for review by the public. So the associated deliverable with this task is going to be a final report as a Microsoft Word file, and then any high resolution files of all photos, figures, and illustrations included in the final report. And this should be submitted via email. And then the associated due date for this deliverable is going to be December 31st of 2025. And so this final report is submitted at the end of the grant period. And it really is a key deliverable, probably one of the most key deliverables. We at DPR use it to share and promote grant results and outcomes. And so again, these examples of objective 1 tasks and deliverables are just a handful of the objective 1 tasks that are included. The full objective 1 can be found in the proposal application. They're nearly identical between, again, the Alliance and research grants ones, with the exception of task 1.2. And again, that's going to be the research plan or the outreach plan. And so if you download the proposal application form, you'll be able to read through objective 1 in its totality. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about an example objective from one of our sample scope of work. So this one is going to be from the research scope of work. And so in bold here, and in that second bullet point, we have the applicable goal from a few slides back, and that's just to remind us of what the goal of that project was, or what one of the 3 goals of that project was. And so this objective 2, is relating directly to that goal. So objective 2 is going to be identify the most effective prophylactic treatment and delivery method for suppression of Xylella fastidiosa in grapevine. And so I think it's important to note that the objective is similar to the goal. So again, as a reminder, the goal is there, evaluate prophylactic treatments and delivery methods for suppressing Xylella fastidiosa in grapevine. So again, they're very similar, but the objective is more specific and really focuses in on a portion of the goal to be achieved here. All right, so moving on to the tasks. So tasks are going to be descriptions of the step-by-step work plan activities that must be completed in order to achieve the stated objectives. So again, tasks support objectives. Tasks should thusly be closely correlated to the objectives. And yeah, again, just to reiterate, the tasks are really going to explain how the project is going to get done at the end of the day. So tasks may include things like modeling, experiments, analyses, field trials, meetings, developing training materials, and conducting surveys. These are just a handful of examples. This is by no means in a complete list. There are many, many more tasks out there. And then at the end of the day, tasks are generating data and other end results. And this data and results are then what gets reported to DPR in the deliverables. And so a sample task from the research scope of work is going to be the task we see here in bolded, is kind of an overview of it, and then some more specifics afterwards in non-bolded text. So task 2.1, greenhouse study to assess the effects of 3 different foliar sprayed antimicrobial compounds on Xylella fastidiosa in grapevines. So the task here is that grapevines will be inoculated with Xylella fastidiosa and populations will be allowed to grow for 1 month. After the incubation period, 3 compounds that have been shown to reduce Xylella fastidiosa populations in laboratory settings will each be combined with a surfactant and applied to the foliar tissue. Grapevines sprayed with water and surfactant will serve as a positive control. Grapevines will be arranged using a random block design, and Pierce's disease symptoms will be quantitatively measured, and tissue samples will be collected for bacterial quantification via quantitative real-time PCR or QRT PCR. And so one thing I want to highlight here is that this task, I think, does a really good job of striking a balance between being too specific and too general. So we really don't want to be overly specific here. If you're too specific in your tasks, you risk kind of pushing yourself into a corner. Myself and a lot of my colleagues are scientists who have conducted research. We understand kind of the process and how quickly things may go awry or, off the rails a little bit. And so we really recommend kind of trying to avoid being overly specific and avoid having to, again, kind of push yourself in a corner. Again, kind of related, I mentioned amendments earlier, how if, for example, a principal investigator or a key personnel changes throughout the course of the project, that is going to trigger an amendment, which again is a formal process, requires the agreement go out for signature again to account for the changes. This is another area where an amendment may be triggered if initially the task is written so specifically, and then when it's actually conducted, in the real world and actually carried out, if one of the components, was not able to be carried out as written, it could trigger an amendment. So again, it's one of those things that we recommend trying to avoid being overly specific in order to avoid having to go through an amendment process for that purpose. At the same time, we do want to recommend that you avoid being too general here. If you're too general, there likely will not be enough information for reviewers to be able to understand your plan and understand how you're going to actually carry out these tasks to fulfill the objectives. So to give a little more information on tasks, again, when describing tasks, try and avoid being overly specific. So this could be things like proposed experimental design or statistical analyses. For example, if, in the previous example, things like the number of plants that would be included in the study is an example of something that maybe is not necessarily appropriate. Again, really detailed things related to proposed experimental or statistical analyses are likely not appropriate here. And kind of as a side note, I do want to note that there are more appropriate places for that sort of information. And so as part of the proposal application, you'll be responding to 4 different questions. And so in question 4 of both the research and alliance grants application, you'll be providing more information on the project, how the project's going to be carried out. And then I briefly touched a couple slides back on task 1.2. So that's going to be your research plan or your outreach plan for the research or alliance grants, respectively. And in that is going to be due, again, 30 days after the grant is executed. And that'll be an opportunity to really detail out some of those more specific experimental design information, or more information on statistical analyses and things like that. So that's going to be a more appropriate place as opposed to these tasks. Again, your task descriptions should provide enough detail to show that there is going to be a clear plan for achieving the project's objectives. But again, it should be broad enough to allow for some flexibility in the experimental design. And then, as I mentioned, instead of incorporating these detailed task descriptions in the scope of work, you can include them in question 4 and then, or in the research plan or outreach plan. All right, so moving on to deliverables. So deliverables essentially are there to support tasks. So deliverables are the end result or products of tasks. They provide tangible and specific proof that a task has been completed. And these deliverables describe whether the task was successful or not. And so this is, I would say, an important thing to emphasize and note here is that tasks are capable of failing. Again, myself and many of my colleagues are scientists. We've seen firsthand how tasks can fail. And so I would say it's important to keep that in mind, because a deliverable is still going to need to be submitted in cases where a task is not successful. And so a deliverable should be written to be general enough that it's able to cover all possible results or all possible, end products or outcomes, including the possibility of failure. And then I'd also like to emphasize there should be 1 or more deliverables specified for each task, and each deliverable needs to specify a due date. So here we have some example deliverables from the research scope of work. On the left-hand side here, we have our first example. This is for task 2.1. That's that greenhouse study to assess the effects of 3 different foliar sprayed antimicrobial compounds. And the deliverable here is a report detailing results along with tables, figures, images, and statistical analyses as needed to support the findings. So I think this is a really good deliverable. It's general in nature. It covers all outcomes. And then on the right-hand side here, we see example 2, publish for task 5.3, publish results of the project in trade journals. And the associated deliverable is final drafts of articles to be published in trade journals will be submitted 20 business days prior to the publishing date. And I just want to highlight this 20 business days comes directly from our terms and conditions. It is a requirement that anything being released to the public, any deliverables being released to the public, are sent to DPR staff for review prior to release. And that's not at all to do anything like censor what you say or edit what you say. It's really just intended for us to ensure that the deliverable is accurately describing the task, and then to ensure things like there's no promotion or disparaging of any specific pesticide brand or anything like that. All right, I want to touch really quickly on linear tasks. And so linear tasks are going to be tasks that rely on the completion of a previous task. And so an example of this would be if one of your tasks is to carry out a field trial, and then you have a subsequent task that's associated with analyzing the results of those trials. It's really essential that those 2 tasks have separate due dates. And so, separate due dates. Often if there's a situation where maybe one task sees some sort of delay or something like that, it's really more appropriate, again, that they don't have identical due dates, so it's not kind of a compounding delay. And then I'd like to also touch on recurring tasks. So recurring tasks are going to be tasks that repeat themselves, and they include multiple deliverable due dates. So things like attending multiple conferences, administering multiple trainings, conducting multiple field trials. So maybe you're conducting the same field trial 2 years in a row to get additional data. Something like that is going to be an example of a recurring task. And so an example of what this might look like is going to be shown here. So we have task 5.2 that's going to be outreach. And this task is present most recent results at citrus and grape grower annual meetings. So the deliverable associated with this is going to be the submission of presentation materials 20 business days prior. And again, that 20 business days comes from our terms and conditions. Highly recommend that you go take a look and read through our terms and conditions to fully understand some of these components. And then the due date here for these recurring tasks shows April 30th of 2024. And then April 30th of 2025. Just a couple more considerations for deliverable due dates. Again, I've mentioned that published deliverables, so all deliverables that are intended for release to the public do need to be submitted for review at least 20 days prior to publication. And so by nature of that, the due dates then should be at least 20 days prior to any publication deadlines. The final deliverable due date does need to occur before the project end date of December 31st, 2025. In objective 1, there is the final report due date, which is December 31st, 2025. There's also a draft final report due date that's going to be December 15th of 2025. So in general, we recommend that all deliverable due dates really be before this time, so no later than December 15th of 2025, so that it can be included in the final report. And then it's just a reminder, try and aim to include a moderate level of detail in deliverables. Extensive detail is likely going to be more appropriate in task 1.2, so that's either going to be the research or the outreach plan, depending on what program you are interested in applying for. And so this is just an example of the Alliance scope of work. So we see that the project is employing community science for early detection and rapid response to optimize control of invasive plants in California wildlands. We see that the goal there is to engage and educate community members and field crews. And the related objective to that goal is going to be prepare members of the public and field crew to participate as community scientists in monitoring for early detection and rapid response species. So the associated task to allow the carrying out of that objective is going to be to produce instructional materials, create digital content to teach community scientists how to identify plants and use CalPHYTA to record observations. The content's going to include things like instructional videos. And then part of the effort is going to be creating a social media page to host content and communicate with community members. And then the associated deliverable for this example task is going to be files of all content created along with the web address for the social media page. Files again should be sent to the grant manager at least 20 days prior to publication so that DPR can review and approve it. And then finally, before I open up the floor to any questions, I just want to provide a few more general reminders and some tips for success. Again, so we touched a little bit on linear timelines. We highly recommend that you try and avoid linear timelines where deliverables are dependent on a prior deliverable. Linear timelines can often cause increasingly significant delays when a single deliverable is delayed. And so again, highly recommend avoiding those if possible. Again, if your project ends up funded, your scope of work is going to be used to create a draft grant agreement, and that draft grant agreement, again, should be understandable by members of the public. So we highly recommend things like defining acronyms for the first time and avoiding jargon. I've touched on this a little bit. Highly recommend reading the applicable terms and conditions. There's 2 different versions on our website. There is one that is specific to University of California and California State University entities. And then there is a separate non-CSU version. So make sure you're looking at the correct one based on your organization. And as you're reading through, just verify that no terms are violated within the proposed scope of work. A key example would be something like no travel outside of California is allowable. We often see this come up in cases where an individual would like to present at something like a conference that maybe takes place outside of California. And so within our terms and conditions, we do state that no travel outside of California is allowable, so that we would not be able to reimburse for that type of travel. We recommend that you proofread the entire document carefully, checking that due dates are correctly recorded in the schedule of deliverables table. Again, there are multiple reviewers that are going to be reviewing your application, and it's always best if documents are polished and professional looking. It also makes it easier for reviewers to follow and understand your project. And then finally, remember that reviewers are going to read the entirety of the grant application. So they're going to read all of those questions that are responded to. They're going to read, things like letters of support, things like that. So really try and avoid including redundant information that may not be pertinent to the scope of work. Remember to reduce the use of jargon, and remember to write for all audiences, both scientific and non-scientific. So as I mentioned earlier, this is our email address that you can reach myself and my colleagues. We would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. That email is dprpmgrants.solicitation@cdpr.ca.gov. Also on this slide, we have our website. You can go there for more information about both of our grants programs, along with all of the application materials for both the Alliance and the Research Grants program. And with that, I would like to thank you all for attending and listening, and I would love to open up the floor for questions. I know that took a little longer than I think I was anticipating, so I'm happy to stay on a little longer if there's a lot of questions. Feel free to either raise your hand, unmute yourself, or if you feel more comfortable, you can just drop your questions in the chat, and I would be happy to read them aloud and answer them. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave that email address up if anyone wants to jot it down. But while maybe you're formulating any questions before we reach the end of our time here, I do just want to thank you all again for attending this presentation and take a quick moment to let you know about some of our upcoming presentations. We do have a number of remaining informational sessions still. We have 2 more budget and budget justification presentations. Those are going to be held on September 8th, so next Thursday at the same time, 10 to 11. There will also be another one for November 17th. The deadline for the research grants is going to be September 22nd, and so that November 17th one really is more for Alliance grant applicants than research grant applicants. So if you're a research grant applicant and you would like to learn more about filling out budgets and budget justifications, or you have any questions, please mark on your calendar that September 8th virtual information session. There's going to be another one of these crafting a scope of work meetings. That one's going to be held on October 20th from 10 to 11. Again, probably more applicable for the Alliance grant applicants than the research grant applicants. If you're attending this meeting, you are more than welcome to attend that second one. It's going to be very similar in terms of the presentation, but you're more than welcome to attend again and bring any questions you may have. And then finally, there's going to be 2 general question and answer sessions, and those are going to be held on September 15th and December 1st, again from 10 to 11. And so it's not looking like anyone has any questions, and we have hit the end of our time period. Oh, hold on, I do see one question. Would the Cdpr prioritize projects that reduce chemical pesticides with federal residue tolerances over those that do not have residue tolerances? So if you download DPR's solicitations, this kind of sounds like more of a research grants as opposed to an alliance grants question. If you download the solicitation, the eligibility requirements do specify things like projects that we would prioritize in general. In general, we do prioritize projects that are reducing pesticides that are more toxic in nature. But this year, there's no real specific priorities. Let me know if that does not answer your question, and I can try and provide a little more detail, but I highly recommend looking at our solicitation and looking at the guidance documents and the frequently asked questions, and those will hopefully give you an idea of how your specific project would fit into our scope. All right, so it's not looking like there's any more questions. Again, if you think of more questions as you are filling out your scope of work, your budget, really anything related to the proposal application, please feel free to reach out to us again at dprpmgrants.solicitation@cdpr.ca.gov. We check this email very frequently, and myself or my colleagues would be very happy to answer your questions. So with that, again, thank you for attending this presentation. I hope it was helpful as you prepare your proposal applications, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you so much.